Dear students, after studying this module, you will be able to learn about narcotic and psychotropic substances, understand the punishments under this Act for possession, trafficking and commercial purpose, etc. Know the sources of some basic drugs which are common in India, discuss hand in hand how the Act works. First, the introduction. A drug is any substance that, when absorbed into the body of a living organism, alters normal bodily function. Drugs are chemicals that change the way a person's body works by altering emotions and thoughts. The term narcotic refers medically to any psychoactive compound with any sleep-inducing properties. Drug abuse is an intense desire to obtain increasing amounts of a particular substance. Drug dependence is the body's physical need or addiction to a specific agent. Over the long term, this dependence results in physical harm and behavioral problems which causes tolerance and cross-tolerance. Thus, it creates a vicious cycle. Drugs are smoked, snorted, consumed orally or injected depending on the nature of drug. Some drugs can be used in more than one way. For instance, heroin can be smoked while purer form of heroin can be injected. Injections give a greater kick than oral use or smoking, and hence injecting drug use is more harmful than oral use or smoking. Several substances are banned or controlled in India under the NDPS Act, such as ganja, cocaine, heroin. The major drug laws of India are the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act of 1985 and the Prevention of Illicit Trafficking in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act 1985. The Narcotics Control Bureau (NCB) is the chief regulator of controlled misuse. It works as enforcement and intelligence agency of India, responsible for fighting drug trafficking and the abuse of illegal substances. It was created on 17th March 1986 to enable the full implementation of the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act 1985 and fight its violation through the Prevention of Illicit Trafficking in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act of 1988. NDPS Act of 1985. The system of control of narcotic drugs in India has been put in a place considering the requirement of narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances for medical use and the country's obligations towards the UN conventions. India is a signatory to the UN Convention on Narcotic Drugs, the Convention on Psychotropic Substances and the Convention on Illicit Traffic in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances 1988, which prescribe various forms of control aimed to achieve the dual objective of limiting the use of narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances for medical and scientific purposes as well as preventing the abuse of the same. The administrative and legislative setup in the field of narcotics has been put in place in the country in accordance with the aforesaid spirit of the UN conventions. The basic legislative instrument of the Government of India in this regard is the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances NDPS Act of 1985. Various ministries and departments under the Government of India as well as the state governments exercise various functions pertaining to drug demand and supply reduction. The aspect of drug supply reduction is looked after by various enforcement agencies under the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Home Affairs and state governments. The aspect of drug demand reduction is handled by the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, and that of treatment of drug addicts and their rehabilitation falls under the domain of Ministry of Health. Alongside these stringent provisions, the Act has procedural safeguard as follows. Personal search. Any person being searched has a right to be searched before a gazetted officer or a magistrate. That is under section 50. The officer searching the person has to explain to the person that he has a right to be searched before a gazetted officer or a magistrate, and if the person wishes to be searched before a gazetted officer or a magistrate, he should be taken to the gazetted officer or the magistrate and searched. However, if the officer has reason to believe that it is not possible to take him to a gazetted officer or a magistrate without giving him a chance to part with the drug, controlled substance, etc., he can search him under section 100 of Criminal Procedure Code, section 50 subclause 5 and section 50 subclause 6. Searches as per section 41 of NDPS Act, gazetted officers of the empowered departments can authorize searches. Such authorization has to be based on information taken down in writing. As per section 42, searches can be made under certain circumstances without a warrant from a magistrate or an authorization from a gazetted officer. In case of such searches, the officer has to send a copy of the information taken in writing on the grounds of his belief to his immediate official superior within 72 hours. Arrests. The person who is arrested should be informed as soon as may be the grounds of his arrest, section 52 subclause 1. If the arrest or seizure is based on warrant issued by a magistrate, the person or the seized article should be forwarded to that magistrate, section 52 subclause 2. The officer who arrests a person has to make a full report of his official superior within 48 hours, section 57. Immunities for drug offences. Officers acting in discharge of their duties in good faith under the Act are immune from suits, prosecution and other legal proceedings, section 69. Addicts. Addicts charged with consumption of drugs, section 27, or with offences involving small quantities will be immune from prosecution if they volunteer for de-addiction. This immunity may be withdrawn if the addict does not undergo complete treatment, section 64A. Offenders. Central or state governments can tender immunity to an offender in order to obtain his evidence in the case. This immunity is granted by the government and not by the court, section 64. Juvenile offenders. Juvenile offenders below the age of 18 years will be governed by the Juvenile Justice, Care and Protection of Children Act 2000. Immunities to diplomats as applicable. Next is punishments under NDPS 1985. The Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act 1985 views drug offences very seriously and prescribes stiff penalties. The Act follows a graded system of punishment, varying on this fact where the offence pertains to small, commercial and intermediate quantities of narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances. For offences involving commercial quantities of drugs, a minimum penalty of 10 years rigorous imprisonment is prescribed, which may extend to 20 years. Repeat offences attract 1.5 times the penalty, in a few cases even the death penalty. Under NDPS Act, abetment, criminal conspiracy and even attempts to commit an offence attract the same punishment as the offence itself. Preparation to commit an offence attracts half the penalty. Repeat offences attract 1.5 times the penalty and in some cases death penalty. Since the penalties under this Act are very stiff, several procedural safeguards have been provided in the Act. Some immunities are also available under the Act. Narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances have several medical and scientific uses. However, they can be and are also abused and trafficked. India's approach toward narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances is enshrined in Article 47 of the Constitution of India, which mandates that the state shall endeavour to bring about prohibition of the consumption except for medicinal purposes of intoxicating drinks and of drugs which are injurious to health. The same principle of preventing use of drugs except for medicinal use was also adopted in the 3 international conventions on drug related matters, viz. Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs 1961, Convention on Psychotropic Substances 1971 and the UN Convention Against Illicit Traffic in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances 1988. India has signed and ratified these 3 conventions. India's commitment to prevention of drug abuse and trafficking predates the coming into force of the 3 conventions. Anyone who contravenes the NDPS Act will face punishment based on the quantity of the banned substance. Where the contravention involves small quantity less than 1 kg with rigorous imprisonment for a term which may extend to 6 months or with fine which may extend to 10,000 or with both. Where the contravention involves quantity lesser than the commercial quantity but greater than the small quantity with rigorous imprisonment for a term which may extend to 10 years and with fine which may extend to rupees 1 lakh. Where the contravention involves commercial quantity with the rigorous imprisonment for a term which shall not be less than 10 years but which may extend to 20 years and shall also be liable to fine which shall not be less than rupees 1 lakhs but may extend to rupees 2 lakhs. Now, what is the purpose of the Act? The Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances NDPS Act of 1985 was framed taking into account India's obligations under the 3 UN drug conventions as well as Article 47 of the Constitution. This Act prohibits, except for medical or scientific purposes, the manufacture, production, trade, use, etc. of narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances. The government's policy has thus been to promote their use for medical and scientific purposes while preventing their diversion from licit sources and prohibiting illicit trafficking and abuse. Unlike the earlier Opium Acts and the Dangerous Drugs Act, which it replaced, the NDPS Act has given the power of enforcement to various central and state law enforcement agencies, thus spreading the net of law enforcement far and wide. The NDPS Act, it is also possible for the central and state governments to notify any new class of officers of any department to enforce. The NDPS Act divides the powers and responsibility of regulation of illicit activities. Section 9 of the Act has listed various activities which the central government can, by rules, regulate, while Section 10 lists various activities which the state governments can, by rules, regulate. Thus, we have NDPS rules of the central government and the state. NDPS rules framed by each state government under the same Act. These are enforced by the central or the concerned state government. The NDPS Act has created statutory authorities such as the Narcotics Commissioner, Section 5, and the Competent Authorities, Section 68D, and the Administrator, that is Section 68G. The organization headed by the Narcotics Commissioner is known as the Central Bureau of Narcotics, CBN. Another authority called the Narcotics Control Bureau was created through a notification under Section 4 of the Act. Each of these authorities has specified functions. Government business is divided in the central government as per the allocation of business rules. As per these rules, the NDPS Act is administered by the Ministry of Finance, Department of Revenue. However, matters pertaining to drug demand reduction are handled by Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, MSJE. Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment supports various NGOs involved in drug demand reduction. Ministry of Health, Government of India, which is responsible for all health issues, runs several drug de-addiction centers in the government hospitals across the country. The Narcotics Control Bureau under the Ministry of Home Affairs coordinates actions by various functionaries, central and the state, under the NDPS Act. The state governments also have their own health departments and social welfare departments, each of which has its own set of activities relating to drug demand reduction. Narcotic drugs are of two kinds, natural and synthetic. Natural narcotic drugs of great medicinal use such as morphine and codeine are produced from opium. Synthetic narcotic drugs are manufactured in factories and do not need any plant products as raw material. Thus, the manufacture of natural narcotic drugs indirectly affects the demand for opium and the area in which farmers should be allowed to cultivate opium. Hence, sudden change in production levels of natural narcotic drugs should be avoided to cause least difficulties to the farmers. India is one of the few countries that are internationally permitted to grow opium, and successive resolutions of the UN Economic and Social Council require India to maintain a balance between demand and supply. Thus, on the one hand, India shares with the other opium poppy growing countries the responsibility of ensuring that there is adequate supply of opium and opiates in the world, and on the other has the responsibility to avoid excessive accumulation of stocks. Now, legal production of opium in India. Legal cultivation of opium for medicinal purpose is carried out in India only in selected areas under strict licensing conditions. Each year, the central government notifies the selected tract where such cultivation will be permitted and the general conditions for eligibility of the license. The essential condition for issue of license is fulfillment of minimum qualifying yield criteria, specified in number of kilograms per hectare. Cultivators who have tendered at least this quantity in the previous year are eligible for the license. The license, among other conditions, specifies the maximum area in which the opium crop can be sown. The crop year starts from 1st October and ends on 30th September each year. Central Bureau of Narcotics is responsible for overall supervision of cultivation as per provisions of NDPS Act 1985 and Narcotics, Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Rules India of 1985. Officers of CBN measure each field and exercise controls to ensure that no excess cultivation takes place. The extraction of opium takes place during the months of February and March. Farmers still use the traditional method where they lance each poppy capsule manually with a special blade-like tool, a process known as lancing. The lancing is done in late afternoon or evenings. The opium latex, which oozes out and congeals in the night, is scraped and collected manually the next morning. Each poppy capsule is given 3 to 4 lancings. All such opium collected is required to be necessarily tendered to the government at specially set up opium collecting centers in early April. Opium is checked for quality and consistency and weighed at the centers. All the opium procured is sent to government opium and alkaloid factories situated at Nimmo and Ghazipur. Opium is dried and processed at these factories for export and is also used for extraction of various products like codeine phosphate, thebaine, morphine sulfate and noscapine, etc. Now we will conclude with the summary. So far you have studied drug abuse and drug dependence, the NDPS Act, regulations, punishments under NDPS and categories of people with immunities.